My name is Sister Agnes, and I am 87 years old. To the people of Maple Creek, I am a gentle relic, a woman who has dedicated her life to God in quiet contemplation. They see these wrinkled hands and assume they have only ever been folded in prayer or offered in comfort. They are wrong. These hands held the shears that cut a young girl's hair, and these ears heard the screams that the stone walls of the abbey were built to muffle. The peace you see in my eyes is not piety, it is the unnerving calm that follows a storm that has raged inside a soul for over 60 years. I wasn't sent to St. Jude's Abbey, I chose it. At 19, I believed I was answering a divine calling, a summons to a life of purity and service. The abbey, nestled deep in the wooded hills far from any town, seemed a paradise of stone and stained glass. But paradise has a gatekeeper, and ours was the Reverend Mother Beatrice. She was a woman carved from ice and scripture, with a gaze that could strip the leaves from a tree, and a belief that the path to God was paved with suffering. She taught us that the body was a sinful cage for the soul, and it was her sacred duty to break the cage to let the spirit fly. We, the young sisters, believed her. We mistook her cruelty for devotion and her tyranny for faith. Everything changed the day Alara was brought to us. She wasn't a girl with a calling, she was a girl with a sentence. Barely 17, with eyes that held the last embers of a wildfire, she had been sent by her family to have her defiance prayed out of her. I remember her standing in the cloister, her simple cotton dress a splash of defiant color in our world of black and gray. Reverend Mother Beatrice circled her like a vulture, her lips curled into a smile that held no warmth. "We will purge the sin of willfulness from you, child," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "Here, you will learn the beauty of obedience." That was the day I learned that obedience and damnation could look terrifyingly alike. The first ritual of erasure was the shearing. It was my turn to perform the duty. My hands trembled as I held the cold, heavy shears to Alara's thick, chestnut hair. She didn't cry. She just stared at her own reflection in my eyes, and in them, I saw a question she was too afraid to ask. You're going to do this to me?" The locks of hair fell to the cold stone floor, each one a severed memory of the world she had lost. As I draped the rough woolen habit over her shoulders, I told myself I was doing God's work. I was helping a lost soul. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted, a cold, hard thing that felt less like faith and more like fear. I was a cog in a machine I was only just beginning to understand. Alara's spirit was not easily broken. She was punished for the smallest infractions, a glance held too long, a prayer whispered too slowly, a tear that escaped during evening vespers. The punishments were medieval, designed not just to cause pain but to humiliate. Reverend Mother Beatrice called them corrective penance. I saw Alara forced to kneel on uncooked rice for hours in the freezing chapel, her knees bled. I saw her denied food for days, subsisting only on water and the stale bread of humility. And I, along with the other sisters, did nothing. We averted our eyes. We offered up silent prayers, telling ourselves it was for Alara's salvation, but we were really praying for our own, terrified that her defiance would splash onto us. The whispers started soon after. At night, in the stark, cold dormitory, we would hear things. A muffled cry from the infirmary wing, a place no one was allowed to enter without the Reverend Mother's explicit permission. We would hear the heavy tread of Father Marcus, the visiting confessor, walking the halls at hours when all holy men should have been asleep. Girls would be taken for private spiritual guidance, and return shadows of their former selves, their eyes vacant, their hands shaking. They never spoke of what happened. A new, unspoken vow had been added to our sacred oaths, the vow of silence, born not of devotion, but of pure, unadulterated terror. I remember one night, I saw Alara being led toward the infirmary by Beatrice. Alara's eyes met mine across the dark corridor. There was no fight left in them. There was only a silent, desperate plea. I looked away. I pulled my rosary from my belt, the wooden beads cold against my skin, and I began to pray. I prayed for her soul, for her strength, for God's mercy. But the truth, the ugly, damning truth I have carried all these years, is that I was not praying for her. I was praying for myself. Praying that whatever darkness lived in that infirmary would be satisfied with her and pass me by. This story is not one of righteousness or heroic faith. It is my confession. For 60 years, I have lived with the ghosts of St. Jude's Abbey. I stayed when I should have fled. I was silent when I should have screamed. Now, at the end of my life, the silence is a cancer in my soul, and it will be silent no more. I will tell you what happened behind those consecrated walls. I will tell you what I, Sister Agnes, witnessed. I will tell you about the worst things imaginable, the things no one could believe, because believing them would mean admitting that the devil can sometimes wear a crucifix. If you can already feel the cold stone of the Abbey walls closing in, please like this video and subscribe to hear the rest of Sister Agnes's chilling confession. What do you think was happening in the infirmary? Comment your thoughts below, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss. The dormitory was a long, cold hall where 30 cots were arranged in perfect, unforgiving rows. It was a place of enforced silence, but silence is never truly empty. Our silence was filled with the sound of stifled sobs, the rustle of trembling hands clutching blankets, and the soft, rhythmic creak of the floorboards as the night proctor made her rounds. Most of all, it was filled with whispers. Not of gossip or girlish secrets, but of fear. We developed a language of gestures, of glances, of breaths held and released in unison. A shared look across the room could communicate a warning. A hand briefly placed on a shoulder in the laundry line could offer a moment of fleeting solidarity. One of the most fragile among us was Sister Martha, a wisp of a girl who seemed to shrink with every passing day. Her piety was genuine, but it was born of terror, not love. She believed every word Reverend Mother Beatrice spoke, and so she believed herself to be profoundly and irrevocably sinful. One morning at breakfast, her hands shaking from the constant chill, she dropped her bowl of watery oatmeal. The ceramic shattered on the stone floor, the sound like a gunshot in the silent refectory. Every head snapped up. Reverend Mother Beatrice rose from her table, her face a mask of cold disappointment. "Wastefulness is a sin against God, Sister Martha," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "You will atone." Martha's punishment was to spend the day in the courtyard, on her knees, scrubbing the flagstones with a coarse brush and freezing water, with no food until she was finished. The late autumn wind was merciless, and by midday, Martha was blue with cold, her movements slow and clumsy. Ilara watched from the scriptorium window, her jaw tight. I was beside her, meticulously copying a passage from Leviticus, but my mind wasn't on the words. It was on the slow, methodical cruelty unfolding outside. "This is not faith," Ilara murmured, so low only I could hear. "This is torture." Before I could caution her, she stood up, walked out of the scriptorium, and went directly to the Reverend Mother's office. A few minutes later, Ilara was marched into the courtyard and forced to kneel beside Martha. Her crime, the sin of pride, for daring to question the Reverend Mother's judgment. I watched them from the window, two small figures kneeling in the vast, cold courtyard. But something had changed. Ilara began to speak to Martha in a low, steady voice. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the effect. Martha stopped shivering. She scrubbed with a new rhythm, matching Ilara's. They were a team. Ilara had taken on Martha's punishment, and in doing so, had robbed it of its power to isolate and humiliate. She had turned an act of penance into an act of rebellion. That night, the whispers in the dormitory were different. They weren't just of fear but of a grudging, dangerous admiration. Ilara had shown us that the system could be resisted, even if it meant inviting more pain. As I lay on my cot, I felt a profound sense of shame. I was older, I had been here longer, yet I had done nothing but watch. My faith had become a shield for my cowardice. Ilara, who had been brought here against her will, was showing more Christian charity and courage than any of us who had willingly taken our vows. The seed of doubt within me began to sprout, its roots cracking the foundations of my hollow piety. The storm was coming, and Ilara had just fired the first lightning bolt into the sky. The courage of one can ignite the fire in many. If you believe in Ilara's spirit of defiance, share this video with someone. Once a month, Father Marcus would visit St. Jude's to hear our confessions. His arrival was announced by the heavy, ominous tolling of the chapel bell. To the outside world, he was a pillar of the diocese, a charismatic man with a booming laugh, and a reputation for profound spiritual insight. To us, he was an extension of Reverend Mother Beatrice's reign, another pair of eyes, another judge. The confessional was not a place of solace, it was an interrogation chamber. It was a small, dark box where you were expected to lay your soul bare, only to have your vulnerabilities collected, catalogued, and later used against you by the Reverend Mother. The girls would enter the booth with trembling hope, desperate for a kind word, a moment of grace. They would emerge pale and shaken, their eyes downcast. Beatrice would often say, "Father Marcus has expressed concern about the state of your soul," a phrase we all knew was a prelude to a new round of penance. They had perfected a system of spiritual surveillance. The priest would mine our sins and the abbess would mete out the punishment. It was a flawless, unbreakable cycle of control, sanctioned by God Himself. I decided to test the system. During my own confession, I knelt in the darkness, the scent of old wood and incense heavy in the air. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," I began, my voice a nervous whisper. "I am struggling with doubt. I see suffering among the younger sisters, and I question if it is truly God's will." I didn't mention Beatrice. I didn't mention Alara or Martha. I kept my words vague, a spiritual crisis, nothing more. I was probing for a flicker of compassion, a sign that he was a man of God, not just a man of the institution. His voice came through the screen, smooth and syrupy, but with an undercurrent of steel. "Ah, Sister Agnes. The sin of pride is a clever one, is it not? It masks itself as compassion. You see suffering and, in your arrogance, believe you know better than the wisdom of the Church, better than the Reverend Mother who has been tasked with guiding these souls. You are not seeing suffering, my child. You are seeing purification. Your doubt is not a crisis of faith, it is a failure of it. You are letting the devil whisper into your ear." His words were a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He had taken my nascent empathy and twisted it into a spiritual failing. He made me the sinner. I left the confessional feeling confused and ashamed, my resolve dissolving into a puddle of guilt. He was right, wasn't he? Who was I to question God's servants? This was how they maintained control. They didn't just punish our bodies, they colonized our minds, turning our own conscience into our jailer. The shadow of Father Marcus loomed large over the abbey, and I realized with a sickening certainty that there was no one to appeal to. He and Beatrice were two sides of the same corrupt coin, and God, it seemed, was not watching. Psychological control can be more brutal than any physical punishment. Have you ever felt your own thoughts being turned against you? The infirmary was located at the far end of the West Wing, a place of sickness, and we all suspected secrets. It was run by Sister Ophelia, a woman well into her 90s, whose mind was as faded as her wimple and whose hearing had long since departed. Because of her frailty, younger nuns were often assigned to assist her. It was a dreaded duty, filled with the scent of rubbing alcohol and decay. One week the duty fell to me. My stomach churned with a mixture of dread and a strange, morbid curiosity. This was my chance to get close to the source of the whispers, to the locked door at the end of the hall that everyone pretended did not exist. The main infirmary was a small, clean ward with a few beds for sisters with fevers or frailties. But beyond it, past a heavy oak door that was always bolted, was another room. This was the source of the rumors. Beatrice called it the seclusion room, for sisters who needed quiet contemplation to overcome spiritual hysterics. No one believed her. My days were spent changing linens, preparing herbal remedies, and listening to Sister Ophelia hum tunelessly. But my nights were spent listening. I would lie on the small cot in the corner, feigning sleep, my ears straining to catch any sound from beyond that forbidden door. For 2 nights there was nothing but the groaning of the old building, and the wind whistling through the eaves. I began to think I was foolish, that the whispers were just the product of overactive imaginations fueled by fear. Then, on the third night, I heard it. It wasn't loud. It was a soft, rhythmic sound. A sob. A young woman's sob, muffled by the thick wood of the door. My blood ran cold. I sat up on my cot, every muscle in my body tense. The sobbing continued for a few minutes and then stopped abruptly, replaced by a different sound. It was a man's voice. Low and murmuring. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was not a voice of comfort. It was the voice of a predator, calm and deliberate. And I recognized it. It was the same smooth, syrupy voice that had twisted my doubts in the confessional. It was Father Marcus. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it would break. He was in there. With one of the girls. The private spiritual guidance, the seclusion room, it was all a lie. The horrifying truth crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. The infirmary wasn't a place for healing. It was a cage. It was his hunting ground. I stayed frozen on my cot for what felt like hours, long after the voices ceased, and the sound of a heavy bolt being drawn echoed in the hall. I stared at the door, which had once been a symbol of mystery, and now saw it for what it was, a gateway to hell. I finally understood the vacant eyes of the girls who returned from their guidance. I understood the ever-present terror that hung in the air of St. Jude's like a shroud. This was not about breaking spirits for God. This was about breaking girls for the pleasure of a monster protected and enabled by our Reverend Mother. And I, in my silence, was enabling her. The guilt was suffocating, a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I had to do something. But what? The moment a suspicion becomes a certainty is life-altering. If this story made your heart race, please like and subscribe. After what I heard outside the infirmary door, despair was a constant companion. The evil felt too big, too entrenched. Beatrice and Marcus were protected by the very walls of the abbey and the authority of the church itself. What could one frightened nun do? But then I would look at Alara. The punishments had taken a toll on her, but they had not extinguished the fire in her eyes. If anything, they had refined it into a sharp, focused point of defiance. She knew she couldn't win with a direct assault, so she began a silent, invisible war. It started in small ways. In the scriptorium, a bottle of ink would accidentally be knocked over, ruining a week's worth of Reverend Mother Beatrice's meticulous financial ledgers. In the laundry, the girls, following Alara's subtle lead, began to work with excruciating slowness, causing a backlog that infuriated the proctors. A key to the root cellar, where the meager treats for feast days were stored, went missing, for a full day, just long enough for a few apples and pieces of dried fruit to find their way to the hungriest novices. These were tiny acts almost impossible to prove as deliberate, but they sent a powerful message: we are not broken. We are still here. Watching Alara gave me a strange and unfamiliar feeling, hope. It was a dangerous feeling, but it was also intoxicating. Her courage made my cowardice feel sharp and painful. I knew I couldn't storm the infirmary or denounce the Reverend Mother in the chapel. But I could do something. My opportunity came during my week overseeing the kitchens. The abbey's pantry was kept locked and the food was strictly rationed. The novices were always hungry, their bodies thin, and their energy low, a state that Beatrice believed kept them humble and focused on the spiritual. One evening, as I was locking up, I looked at the heavy iron key in my hand. It was my turn to be the jailer of our sustenance. On impulse, my heart pounding, I walked to the herb garden, a place no one would think to look, and tucked the key beneath a loose flagstone behind the rosemary bushes. The next morning, I made a great show of being distressed. The pantry key is gone, I announced, my voice trembling with manufactured panic. I must have misplaced it. A search was organized, but of course, nothing was found. For 24 hours, until a locksmith could be brought from the town, the pantry door remained unlocked. It was chaos, but a quiet, beautiful chaos. Girls slipped in and out, their pockets filled with nuts, bread, and cheese. For the first time in months, I saw genuine smiles on their faces. I saw color return to their cheeks. I saw them sharing their stolen goods in hushed corners of the cloister, their bond of suffering momentarily transformed into a bond of conspiracy and joy. Beatrice was furious, but she could prove nothing. That small act, my first true act of defiance against her rule, felt more holy than any prayer I had ever uttered. I had chosen the hungry over the powerful. I had chosen the whispers of rebellion over the silence of fear. I had chosen a side. Sometimes the smallest act of defiance can be the most powerful. Like this video if you cheered for Sister Agnes. What will happen when Beatrice's suspicion turns to Agnes? My small act of rebellion with the pantry key had emboldened me, but it had also put me on Reverend Mother Beatrice's radar. I felt her cold eyes on me more often, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. My duties were changed. I was removed from the kitchens and assigned to the archives, a dusty, forgotten room in the Abbey's oldest wing. It was meant as a punishment, a solitary confinement among crumbling books and forgotten records. But it was there in the dust and the silence that I found the ammunition for our war. The archives were a mess. Decades of records were piled in rotting wooden chests. My task was to catalog them, a tedious job that would take months. One afternoon, while trying to move a heavy chest filled with records of past novices, one of the termite-eaten legs gave way. The chest crashed to the floor, spilling its contents. As I knelt to clean up the mess, I noticed that the floorboard beneath, where the chest had stood, was loose. Curiosity, a feeling long suppressed within me, took over. I pried the board up with my fingertips. Beneath it was a small, tin box, rusted with age. My hands shook as I lifted it out and opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried, faded lavender, were the secret treasures of a girl I had never known. There was a faded blue ribbon, the kind a girl might wear in her hair. There was a small, crudely whittled wooden bird. And there was a diary, a small, leather-bound book filled with delicate, looping handwriting. The first page read, "The property of Clara Wilde, Anno Domini 1932. I sat on the dusty floor and read. Clara had been a novice here 20 years before me. Her early entries were filled with hope and devotion. But the tone quickly darkened. She wrote of the Reverend Mother's cruelty, the hunger, the isolation. Then she began to write about Father Marcus. She didn't use his name. She called him the shepherd. Her entries became frantic, coded. The shepherd came for another special blessing tonight. He says the pain is to purify me. He says my screams are prayers. Further in, an entry read, he took me to the quiet room. He says no one can hear you talk to God in there. I don't think it is God who listens. The last entry was almost illegible, the pencil strokes dug deep into the paper. He is coming. I hid my book. Tell my mother I was a good girl. Tell her I tried. The official Abbey record, which I found later in the chest, stated that Sister Clara Wilde had been sent home, having been found to lack the spiritual conviction for a life of service. It was a lie. This diary was her ghost. It was her voice, screaming from the grave. This small, forgotten book was proof. It was not just our word against theirs anymore. It was Clara's. It was the undeniable, physical evidence of a secret history of abuse, a history that stretched back decades. I held the truth in my hands, and it was heavier than any stone. A voice from the past can change the future. If this discovery gave you chills, hit the like button. The stakes have never been higher. Clutching Clara's diary, I felt as though the very air in the Abbey had changed. It was thinner, sharper. The shadows in the corners of the cloisters seemed darker, more menacing. I now looked at Reverend Mother Beatrice and Father Marcus not just as authoritarians, but as partners in a monstrous crime. I began to watch them, not with the fear of a subordinate, but with the cold, analytical gaze of a witness gathering evidence. I saw everything I had previously missed, everything my fear had blinded me to. I saw the way Beatrice would subtly nod to Father Marcus after evening vespers, a silent, almost imperceptible signal. I saw the way he would leave a small, unmarked envelope on her desk before he departed the abbey each month. I saw the way she would select the girls for private spiritual guidance. It was never the meek, obedient ones like Martha. It was always the girls with a spark of defiance, the ones who questioned, the ones who had not yet been fully broken. It was the Alaras and the Claras. The horrifying truth assembled itself in my mind like a perfect, diabolical machine. Beatrice wasn't just turning a blind eye to Father Marcus's sins. She was his procuress. She was the gatekeeper. She used her position of absolute authority to identify the vulnerable and rebellious girls, then used punishment and spiritual manipulation to isolate and weaken them. She broke their wills, and then she delivered them to him. He, in turn, ensured her position of power within the diocese remained unchallenged, his reports painting St. Jude's as a model of piety and discipline. Their alliance was one of mutual benefit, built on a foundation of broken bodies and shattered souls. Her sin was not an action, it was active, enthusiastic complicity. She didn't just permit the evil, she cultivated it. It explained everything, the endless punishments, the constant hunger, the psychological warfare. It was all designed to tenderize the meat for the wolf. She wasn't a shepherdess protecting her flock, she was a farmer fattening her lambs for the slaughter. This realization was more terrifying than anything I had previously imagined. The problem wasn't a single predator, it was a deeply rotten system, protected by layers of authority and piety. Going to the bishop was not an option. He was a close friend of Father Marcus, they hunted together every autumn. He would sooner burn Clara's diary than believe its contents. We were utterly and completely on our own. The walls of St. Jude's were not just keeping the world out, they were keeping us in, trapped in a conspiracy of silence and sin. I knew then that we couldn't just expose a nun, we had to find a way to tear down an entire corrupt kingdom. The conspiracy is deeper and darker than ever imagined. If you are on the edge of your seat, hit like and share this story. We are approaching the climax. The weight of Clara's diary felt like a burning coal in my hands. I knew I couldn't keep it hidden for long. My room could be searched at any time on Beatrice's whim. There was only one person in the abbey I could trust, one person who had the fire to see this through to the end. I had to tell Alara. I found her in the empty chapel late one night, polishing the candlesticks, a punishment for speaking out of turn during dinner. The moonlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful, distorted patterns on the stone floor. "I need to show you something," I whispered, my voice trembling. I led her to the darkened archives and by the light of a single candle, I showed her the tin box. I watched her face as she read Clara's words. The fire in her eyes turned into a cold, hard inferno. She didn't cry. Her grief was too cold, too sharp for tears. She closed the diary gently, her knuckles white. "How many more?" she whispered, her voice rough with fury. "How many Claras have there been?" In that moment, we were no longer just a young novice and a timid older nun. We were co-conspirators. The diary was our weapon, but it was useless inside these walls. We had to get it out. We had to get it to someone who would listen, someone beyond the reach of Father Marcus and the bishop. Our eyes fell on the same solution at the same time, the weekly supply truck. It was our only link to the outside world. It brought us our food, our mail, our necessities, and it took away our tithes, our correspondence, and the linens we laundered for the parish church in the nearby town of Havenwood. Our plan was desperate and full of risk. We couldn't just hand the diary to the driver, Mr. Henderson. He was a devout man who revered the Reverend Mother. We had to hide it. The outgoing charity linens were packed in large wicker baskets. It was the perfect place. No one inspected them too closely. But getting the diary into one of those baskets undetected would require a major diversion. Beatrice watched everything like a hawk, especially on delivery day. We needed to pull her attention, and the attention of all the proctors, away from the laundry depot. "I'll do it," Alara said, her voice firm. "I will be the diversion." Her plan was terrifyingly simple. She would feign a seizure during morning prayers, just as the truck was scheduled to arrive. In the ensuing chaos, as everyone rushed to her side, I would have a window of opportunity. It would be my task to slip into the laundry room, hide the diary deep within a basket of folded altar cloths, and return before anyone noticed I was gone. "They'll punish me," Alara said, a grim smile on her face. "They'll probably lock me in the infirmary. But it'll be worth it if this book gets out." I looked at this brave, 17-year-old girl, willing to throw herself into the lion's den, and I knew we had no other choice. It was a terrible, desperate gamble, but it was the only one we had. A desperate plan is forged in the shadows. Do you think it will succeed? Let us know in the comments. The morning of the delivery arrived with a cold, gray dawn that mirrored the dread in my heart. The air in the chapel was thick with tension. Every sister could feel it. Alara knelt across the aisle from me, her face pale, but her eyes resolute. We exchanged a single, fleeting glance. It was time. As the first hymn began, the distant rumble of Mr. Henderson's truck could be heard coming up the long Abbey Road. It was the signal. Alara took a deep breath and then, with a horrifyingly realistic cry, she fell to the floor, her body convulsing. Panic erupted. The hymn faltered and died. Nuns rushed forward, their prayers turning to shouts of alarm. Reverend Mother Beatrice pushed through the crowd, her face a mask of irritation and concern. "Take her to the infirmary," she commanded. Now. This was my moment. As all eyes were on Alara being carried from the chapel, I slipped out a side door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Clara's diary was hidden beneath my habit, a cold, hard rectangle against my skin. I moved through the empty corridors, every footstep echoing like a drumbeat. The laundry depot was deserted, just as we'd planned. The wicker baskets stood by the loading dock, waiting for the truck. I found the one filled with the pristine white altar cloths for Havenwood Parish. My hands shook so badly I could barely untie the rope. I shoved the diary deep into the center of the linens, burying it beneath layers of folded cloth. I retied the rope, my prayer a frantic, silent plea to a God I wasn't sure was listening anymore. I turned to leave, my part in the plan complete. And my heart stopped. Reverend Mother Beatrice was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes like chips of ice. She hadn't gone to the infirmary. She had been watching. "Looking for something, Sister Agnes?" she asked, her voice dangerously soft. She knew. She didn't know what precisely, but she knew I was involved. My mind raced, but there was nowhere to run. She strode toward me and her hands patted down my habit with a rough, invasive familiarity. She found nothing. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Alara's little performance was quite convincing, she hissed, her face inches from mine. "But you are a poor actress. Your guilt is written all over your face." She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my flesh like talons. "You will tell me what this is about." Just then, we heard Mr. Henderson's cheerful voice from the loading dock. "Morning, Reverend Mother. Ready for the pickup?" Beatrice's face contorted in a brief flash of indecision. She couldn't create a scene in front of an outsider. She shoved me away from her. "This is not over," she whispered, a threat hanging heavy in the air. She went out to supervise the loading, her gaze fixed on the baskets, then on me. I stood frozen, watching as the basket containing Clara's ghost, our only hope, was loaded onto the truck. The engine roared to life and the truck pulled away, disappearing down the long road. I had succeeded. But as Beatrice turned her cold, furious gaze back on me, I knew I had also condemned Alara, and likely myself. The package is sent but the messengers are trapped. This is the most intense chapter yet. Please like and subscribe to find out what happened to Agnes and Alara. The weeks that followed the truck's departure were the longest of my life. Alara was locked away. Beatrice claimed it was for recovery and reflection after her hysterical fit, but we all knew it was a prison sentence. I was assigned to the most grueling physical tasks in the Abbey, my every move watched by Beatrice and her loyal proctors. I scrubbed floors until my knuckles were raw and worked in the gardens until my back screamed in protest. Every day was a silent war of wills. She was waiting for me to break, to confess my role in whatever she suspected. I was waiting for a sign, any sign, that our desperate gamble had paid off. Then, one rainy Tuesday, a black car, sleek and unfamiliar, rolled up the Abbey Road. Two men in dark suits, accompanied by a grim-faced Monsignor I did not recognize, emerged and went straight to the Reverend Mother's office. They were there for hours. The Abbey was thick with a new kind of silence, one filled with dread and anticipation. Late that afternoon, Father Marcus was summoned. He entered the office looking confident, but when he emerged an hour later, his face was ashen. He was escorted to the black car and driven away. We never saw him again. The next morning, Reverend Mother Beatrice was gone. There was no announcement, no farewell. She simply vanished. A temporary abbess was installed, a kind, elderly woman who seemed bewildered by the state of the convent. The rules were relaxed. The food rations were increased. The door to the infirmary's seclusion room was unlocked and we found it empty. Ilara was gone, too. We were told she had been transferred to a contemplative order better suited to her temperament. It was another lie, another institutional cover-up designed to prevent a scandal. There was no public justice, no trial, no admission of guilt. The monsters had simply been quietly swept under the church's enormous, ancient rug. I stayed at St. Jude's for another 40 years until it was finally closed down, its history, and its sins papered over. I was transferred here, to this quiet parish in Maple Creek, to live out my final years. For decades I held on to the story, a silent witness to a silent crime. I told myself that getting the diary out was enough, that I had done my part. But the institutional silence was its own kind of evil, a final insult to Clara, to Ilara, and to all the girls whose names I never knew. Their suffering had been erased. That is why I am telling you this story now. This is my final confession, my true act of atonement. I am 87 years old. I have made my peace with God, but I have not made my peace with the silence. In the quiet of my room, I can still hear the whispers from the dormitory, I can still see the fire in Ilara's eyes, I can still feel the weight of Clara's diary in my hands. This story is for them. It is my attempt to give them back the voices they were denied, to transform their screams from prayers of pain into shouts of truth that will echo forever. I was a coward for most of my life. I was silent when I should have screamed. Please do not let my mistake be yours. Never, ever allow silence to become a sanctuary for monsters. Thank you for listening to Sister Agnes's story. The fight for justice for the victims of institutional abuse continues to this day. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share it. Let Sister Agnes's final act of atonement be a roar that can no longer be ignored.